The other day, I had like a couple of videos that I wanted to watch about Mexico, especially this one. It is a little long. I hope that you guys don't mind. It's also like 30 minutes. But man, it's about the Mexican economy. And the title, it's very bold. Mexico is about to get rich. That's a bold claim, all right? That's a bold statement. And I, for once, as a Mexican, I want to know what he's talking about. I do know more about the Mexican economy, because it's where I live. I do know what's going on here. And I sort of can't imagine what he's going to talk about. He's going to talk about the very large and growing manufacturing industry here, I'm guessing. But I don't know. It's a long video. And, the title is just bold, right? So I just want to watch it. I can't stay, but I'm happy you restarted doing lives. Fritos, it's always good to see you, man. And don't worry, I'll do many more lives where you can join us. So, are you guys ready? Let's do this, man. I think it's gonna be hella fun. It's time that Mexico takes its place as one of the American countries that surpasses the colonial country in terms of economic might. I think we are very close to surpass Spain, and I would be very happy to do so as well,
Mexico should be a failed state.
Whoa,
This has nothing to do with
okay, Mexico should be a failed state. It's not the first time I hear that. I know that a lot of people, especially uh, the ones, the sort of geographic determinist people, say that Mexico has terrible geography, and it does. It has like terrible geography. I don't think necessarily would make it a fail. Well, maybe. I don't know. Let's hear his points. That's a random start. I know. It's random.
people, culture, or even the politics, but rather with a more powerful force that cannot be changed: geography. Most
Geography.
powerful nations have two key characteristics.
That's southern
a
Mexico,
temperate
by the way.
climate that is favorable for agricultural production, and flat land that is easy for trade and economic expansion. Mexico is far from being temperate or flat. The north is dominated by desert, which makes agricultural and economic growth incredibly difficult. The south is a rugged jungle, which has forced much of the local population into subsistence living. If that didn't make the Mexican geography challenging enough, the nation is full of mountain chains that makes infrastructure incredibly costly. Mexico's greatest geographic asset, its coastlines, is largely mitigated by the rugged interior. Getting goods from the Gulf side to the Pacific side is not cheap, easy, or quick.
It's expensive.
If that
dude.
wasn't challenging enough, Mexican
I mean, just think about it. Trying to move something where there's so many deserts, there's so many mountains, there's a lot of thick jungle. It's just very hard to move stuff around Mexico. And it's just really, really complicated. Yeah, so I despise geographic determinists as they ignore humanity itself. Yeah. Argentina has great geography and no one wants to pretend that they're doing great. Exactly. Yeah, it's not, sure, geography it's very important. And I've read the book from Peter Sehan, the Accidental Superpower, right? Which he talks about, the American geography and how it's great. And it is great. And that probably is very relevant. But there's a lot of other factors, right? Like, well, you mentioned humanity itself, right?
rivers are terrible for navigation. The total
We also
water
have no
flow
rivers.
across all Mexican rivers is about 25% less than that of the Mississippi River alone. While the EU has the Rhine, and South America has the Amazon,
Nada.
Mexico has
Zero.
nothing, with the exception of the Grijalva River, which
Oh.
can only accommodate shallow draft vessels in certain spots. The lack of navigable rivers, paired with the mountainous interior, makes
Yeah. For sure. I always think of the fact that the capital. Oh yeah, the capital is on a lake. Yeah, I know, and that's supposedly some of the best geography we have to offer, really.
domestic trade a costly endeavor. The daunting geography not only
The
hinders
Spaniards
economic
were
activity,
not known for long-term thinking. Yeah, you're right.
but also political stability.
Look at all
Keeping
those
Mexico
mountains,
united
bro.
is no
That's
easy
a lot
task.
of mountains.
Shortly after gaining independence from Spain, Mexico would be rife with insurrections and rebellions.
Yeah.
The challenging geography made it easy for Texas and the provinces of Central America to secede from the motherland. Parts of the Yucatan also seceded
Well-
for several years before rejoining the fold. And when American President James Polk decided that it was time to take a few states from Mexico, the mountainous and arid geography made it difficult for Santa Anna to get troops to the front lines. 13
That is true, though. Of course, it's more complicated than that. There's a lot more factors going on, but we're not going to talk about those. However, yeah, sure, the geography at the end of the day does make it difficult to defend your own country, you know?
years
And that's
later,
Napoleon III.
Napoleon III decided that Mexico should be a puppet of the French
Yep.
Empire. But even the mighty French couldn't handle Mexico's geography.
Bro, can we catch a break? We have an invasion from the Americans, and like 10 years later, we have an invasion of the French. Can we catch a break, dude?
Mexican Republicans were able to remain in power in certain states and would push the French out in about 5 years.
Yeah.
Mexico's harsh geography would make political stability and economic advancement almost impossible. It made the nation an
Sure.
easy target for foreign intervention. The jungles, deserts, mountains, and lack of navigable rivers would be problematic enough on their
Yeah,
own.
exactly. Yeah. In between those interventions, we had a civil war. Yeah.
But all 4 of these features, combined within a country that is nearly 4 times the size of Spain, is a recipe for disaster. Mexico arguably has the worst geography in the world in terms of economic development and
Okay.
political stability. Mexico shouldn't only be a failed state, but should be in a perpetual state of chaos, similar to Afghanistan or the Congo.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's a big take. Okay. Let's think a little bit about that. Mexico would be in perpetual state of chaos. I mean, you could argue it already kind of is, right? There's a lot of stuff going on always. There's already a lot of crime. There's already a lot of big criminal mafias that even control some parts of the country. So you could say it's already very chaotic, right? Yeah, a quarter of all Mexicans didn't survive that war. Yeah, it's crazy. I guess we avenged Mexico when we defeated Napoleon III. Oh yeah, we always make fun of that, you know. Thank God, we're very thankful to the Prussians.
Despite the insane geographical challenges, Mexico is actually doing pretty good. In fact, they're doing better than good. Mexico has the 13th largest economy,
I guess.
when accounting for purchasing power parity. This makes the Mexican economy larger than that of South Korea, Canada, Saudi Arabia, Australia, and the Netherlands. While Mexico had a
It's always great to see these GDP numbers and sort of think that the nation is doing really well. And in some cases, a lot of people are doing very well. I'm doing really well myself. So it's not like things are bad, but you always have to remember Mexico is a very unequal country, very similar to South Africa, for example, where a lot of the wealth is really concentrated in a few hands. And those people are living amazing lives, similarly to the first world countries, but then sort of everyone else is not. So you always have to think about that. Sure, Mexico as a country, I guess you could say, is doing pretty well. But inside the country, there are a lot of desperate people that are suffering, right? Don't think about Mexico in the same light you would think about South Korea, because it's just not.
very turbulent history. The country has made huge gains in the past 100 years.
Similar to
Mexico's
these
explosive
GDP
growth
graphs.
is no coincidence. And by all indications, the Mexican economy will continue to enjoy impressive gains. The likelihood of Mexico reaching economic parity with G7 nations in the coming decades is practically a certainty. Through triumphant hard work, Mexico was able to conquer its formidable geography and get on the path to economic prosperity. Here's how they did it. But first, did you know that less than
I don't know if there's a bunch of prosperity, you know, but whatever. Speaking of geographic determinism, South Korea, practically elevating them in the middle class. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, my dad sends remittances to his parents who stayed in Mexico. Eventually, those hundreds of dollars per month was a lifesaver, and they do. They are a lifesaver for most families who receive
1% of the
remittances.
viewers of this channel are subscribers. If you enjoy the work I do,
So
be sure to subscribe
it's a growing
so you can
economy.
stay
I
up to
guess
date
that's
on my
good.
latest videos.
I am
The
sure
subscriber count also
uh,
makes it easier
we
for
are
me to
going
get
to
replies from
experience a lot of
subject matter
growth,
experts
and a
when
lot of people are
researching
going to get better
videos.
jobs, but
Your support is appreciated.
it's still tough for a lot of people, you know?
When New Spain gained independence and became
There
Mexico,
we go, some
the young
history.
country was perpetually restless. Mexico would be
Yeah.
rife with coups, guerrilla insurgencies, indigenous uprisings, and constitutions with very short lifespans. From 1824 to 1884, Mexico would have 35 different heads of state. Some of these transfers of power were peaceful,
Oh my god.
others, not so much.
It's so weird to see them, you know, like
This high level of political instability, Mexico would struggle to get its
Santa
economy off
Ana,
the
dude.
ground.
That's fucking
Despite the
crazy.
political turmoil,
Look at him. He's
Mexico
still
became
going.
a world leader in the production of silver coins. When new silver deposits were discovered, entirely new cities
That image of shirtless Hidalgo is wild. I know.
would pop up to extract the precious metal. The silver would be purified with mercury and eventually make its way to Mexico City to be minted into coins.
I've heard about
Mexico's
this, yeah.
silver coins were the preferred global currency of the colonial era. The mint in Mexico City would stamp the coins with distinct ridges, a process that was nearly impossible to counterfeit. From the colonies of Upper Canada to the Manila Gallons of East Asia, Mexican silver
Yeah, bro, he really did came every few years, you know? It's crazy.
coins could be found anywhere there is global trade. But Mexico was too good at producing silver coins. By overproducing, the coins would lose their value due to increased supply. Mexico's economy was overly reliant on silver. When
Obviously, now one of the fancier terms in an economy is diversification, right? An economy ideally should be sort of diversified. So if a certain industry is not doing well, the other industries are gonna still help to get some economic output. So ideally, your economy should be diversified, right? But Mexico in the 1800s, it basically depends on silver. You know, silver since the times of the Spanish Empire was really important, right? The Spanish were also very famous for getting a lot of silver from Latin America. Of course, when the Spanish left or the Mexicans kicked the Spanish out, the Mexicans now owned all of these silver, so they sort of continued that trend of processing silver and in this case, turning them into coins, which is something I didn't really knew Mexico was good at, but whatever, man. Bro took the motivation poster way too seriously. Or in Norway's case, instead of diversifying your economy, you can diversify the investments of your portfolio. Yeah, that's probably a little better, you know?
silver would go through bust cycles, the Mexican economy would be hit hard. Mexico's
Norway is really
over-reliance on
built
silver
different.
would start to change when Porfirio Diaz rose to power in 1884. The dictator knew that Mexico had to diversify. To achieve this goal, Mexico must be interconnected by rail. Diaz improved Mexico's creditworthiness and secured loans from London bondsmen and German bankers, and quickly expanded Mexico's rail network. In 1873,
That's an interesting question. How does the Mexican government see or treat indigenous Mexicans? Hold up, let me. Nope. There we go. Um, so short answer is they don't. They don't see them. They just sort of ignore them and let them do their own thing. Uh, there aren't as many of them, I guess. So the government doesn't really pay too much attention. And the thing is, a lot of them are really integrated into Mexican society. So it's not like in the US where there's reservations and sort of the Native Americans have kept a lot of aspects of their culture. In Mexico, the indigenous culture keeps sort of dying, which with each generation that passes, less and less people speak indigenous languages. They are sort of adapting really well to the Mexican culture, I guess, or and the government just doesn't pay attention to them, unfortunately. That's a good thing, really. I guess it's good. I heard reservations suck in the US. They do. They have like a lot of alcoholism problems, and they have a lot of gambling too. And I think that's the thing. You shouldn't really segregate people into reservations. I think you should include them in the general society and culture.
Mexico only had 472 kilometers of rail, but that would explode to nearly 20,000 kilometers in just 40 years. For a country as mountainous as Mexico, building a rail network is neither cheap nor easy. But the Mexicans,
Yeah.
along with notable help
kind
from
of.
Asian
Yeah.
immigrants, completed the challenging task. The rapid rail expansion would also create a connection to the United States via Juarez and El Paso. By connecting with their northern neighbor, Mexico was better suited to export precious metals and import cheap cotton to boost their textile industry. However, Mexico's dependence on US cotton would not last. With rail integration, Mexico could now grow their own cotton. Durango and Coahuila would emerge as major cotton producers, and the raw cotton would be processed into textiles
Until
in
they found
Guadalajara,
gold. Yeah.
Puebla, and Mexico City. By 1910, Mexico was able to produce 78% of its own cotton. In the past, Mexico's economy was handcuffed to the price of silver, but with the newly built railroad, Mexico was building a more dynamic economy. The integrated economy was particularly beneficial to Monterrey, a city located about 1,000 kilometers northeast of Mexico City. Monterrey would emerge as Mexico's financial hub, full
Yeah.
of merchants.
This would be a very industrial city. Uh, yeah, this would be a very wealthy, and it still is one of the most developed cities in Mexico, sort of. Or in Oklahoma's case, they found oil. Yeah,
And
exactly.
financiers that bolstered Mexican production and exports. Monterrey would expand into even newer industries, such as steel production, glass manufacturing, and world-famous Mexican beer.
Yeah.
With a bustling economy, Diaz decided that it was time to put Mexico on the gold standard. It was a clear signal to the world that Mexico was not just a stable country, but one full of attractive investment opportunities. While Diaz supercharged the Mexican economy, he had one major flaw that is common with dictators. He didn't want to give up power.
Yeah, well, that's sort of an understatement. I mean, well, this guy was pretty shitty, and we were talking about indigenous peoples before. This guy would be terrible to many indigenous communities and would almost sort of enslave them, would sort of implement a system of sort of servitude. It was very strange. This guy wasn't that great of a guy. Sure, he did diversify the economy and did all the stuff he mentioned, but he's not a good guy, and he neither should be remembered as a good guy.
The lack of mobility for the top leadership position, in addition to poor treatment
And
of
he didn't
indigenous
want to give
people
up power. He
and
did not.
deteriorating labor conditions in Cananea and Rio Blanco, all made Mexico ripe for revolution. The revolutionary spirit was further fueled when Diaz indicated that he would remain dictator in May 1908, despite stating the contrary only 3 months earlier. As contemporary Justo Sierra said, "There are no institutions in the Republic of Mexico. There is only a man."
And there was
After
just
28
that guy.
years of the Porfirio
Let me
era,
change the title.
Mexico
of
was
the...
ready for a change. The revolution commenced on November 20th, 1910, only 3 months after the country celebrated its 100-year anniversary of independence. The Mexican Revolution would last for 10 to 30 years, depending on which historical analysis you prefer. While the revolution was founded on legitimate political grievances, it nonetheless crippled Mexico's economy. In 1914, Mexico had defaulted on its foreign debt obligations. The ability to attract foreign investment was non-existent. There was a tragic amount of lost lives during the revolution. Mexico's population decreased by 1 million in a single decade. To say that the revolution hindered economic development is a cynical
Or Mexicans thought this in school. Most of this, or a lot of this, yeah, it is an important part of Mexican history. A lot of kids, they try to learn, but in like many countries, a lot of people just aren't interested in history, so they sort of don't pay much attention to it.
understatement. As the revolution progressed, Mexico was more so operated by regional chieftains, as opposed to a united country.
Yeah.
Eventually, two chieftains from Sonora created what would become the Party of the Revolutionary Institution, better known as PRI, through complex political wrangling and military strong-arming. The PRI was able to make Mexico a united country again, although this was not a smooth nor peaceful transformation. The result would be a new political system, unlike any other.
Yeah. It was wicked. Well, no, I wouldn't say wicked. It was.
The
It was
PRI created
weird.
a new political system that can't be easily classified. It drew inspiration from several political philosophies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the PRI was sort of a mix of a monarchy, of communism, of a democracy, nationalism, socialism, and corporatism. Supposedly, it was left wing, although it was very corporatistic, right? It was very, it promoted monopolies. I guess we'll see.
The PRI
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It had like a huge
can best be
meltdown.
described as a monarchy with term limits. The president of Mexico was as powerful as a king, but had a strict 6-year term limit. When his term was approaching its end, the president would handpick his successor. An election would be held for the new incoming president, and on at least a few occasions they actually counted the votes. Instead of having nobles with fiefdoms, Mexico would have other pillars of power: big banks, big businesses, and big labor unions, all of which circulated around big government. Unlike in capitalist societies with divisions of power, Mexico's pillars of power would collude with each other. Instead of competition, these
Yeah, that's 100% true. The banks worked for the corporations worked for the banks, and they all worked for the political party, the government, basically. So it was sort of, it sort of remains that way. Mexicans don't really have that much access to banking. Uh, Starting a business in Mexico is hard, right? You sort of gotta be on the top echelons of society in order to sort of get into this system.
institutions chose collaboration. Labor unions were mostly for show, and businesses felt no pressure to innovate. When workers defied their union bosses and went on strike, the government would send in the army. All land and subsoil would be property of the government, while the laws of land ownership and mineral rights sounds quite communistic. It is actually more similar to a monarchy. The PRI would either manage these assets themselves, or select which business could have a monopoly. The need to adapt and improve was practically non-existent for Mexican businesses. Having
Again, it sort of reminds you of a communist economy because the government controls the assets of the country itself, right? So the government controls the media, the government controls the oil. He mentioned the government literally controlled all of the soil in the land, right? So it wasn't technically communism, but I think you know. Oh, really? My father was part of protests in the 80s and early 90s. I'm remembering that he became. Gosh, I can't read, guys. I'm so sorry. Embittered with his country when Mexico sent the army just straight up to shoot. Yeah, exactly.
friends in high places
That's what they would do. They would
was far more
shoot people.
important. Banks provided little help to everyday Mexicans. Most loans were only accessible to Mexico's big businesses, not small entrepreneurs. Should a Mexican want to start their own business, receiving financing from a bank was practically impossible.
We
and
don't do
expecting
that
the
here.
government to assist in the development of small businesses was a foreign concept. Despite the neglect, many Mexican entrepreneurs moved forward with their ambitions. They would build their businesses, independent from any
Yeah.
reporting to the banks or government. This was the birth of the informal economy in Mexico, fully functioning small businesses, operating without any bank or government services. The informal economy remains very much alive in present-day Mexico. Today, nearly 60% of all Mexican workers are employed in the informal economy.
This is a
This political
well-known
and economic
fact
system
in
meant that
Mexico.
Mexico would have a tiny middle class. Extreme income inequality was the norm. In certain years, Mexico's inequality would be quite comparable to that of apartheid South Africa.
Yes,
While
look at
this
that,
does sound
man.
very
Yeah, that's
dystopian,
fucking horrible.
it provided something that was desperately needed in Mexico.
Jesus
Stability.
Christ.
The Mexican Revolution was so brutal that the people would accept just about anything for the sake of peace. For the most part, the Mexican people tolerated this new structure, sacrificing
Yeah, this is, he mentioned something very important. This system was not perfect, as you can clearly see, but it provided one thing: stability. For all of its existence, Mexico as a country was very chaotic, and always involved in some type of civil war or foreign conflict, or there was always happening. For a couple of years, for a few decades, in fact, this political system at the end of the day was able to sort of provide certain stability, you know? Sort of reminds me of how the modern Chinese communist government handles their own party, you know? It's sort of a pact with the people, right? As long as the Chinese party, the CCP is able to produce this sort of stability and prosperity, the people are going to be okay with the CPP being in power, right? So sort of reminds me of that system. Let me read a few comments. Does Mexico have any chaebol-like companies like Samsung, LG, Hyundai? It's different. The whole South Korean system is different. It doesn't work like that. But you could think, for example, I think you guys know Carlos Slim. He owns the big telecommunications company. In fact, he bought the assets of the Mexican company, and he owns most of the telecommunications in the country. And in fact, he's moved operations through all of Latin America. I guess that would be like the closest thing, you know. But no, it doesn't work like in South Korea, you know. I think all of this knowledge is making me have a migraine. Yeah, it's a lot, right? It's a lot of information.
economic progress, for the sake of political stability, was a core component of Mexico's social contract.
Yeah,
Mexico's
exactly.
elites got
And a good
very,
chunk of the populace is not
very
surviving
rich in
it.
this system,
I can't
but
blame the
their
average
greed was
person for just wanting
insatiable.
peace.
There is one other prominent pillar of power, completely independent from the collusion scheme: the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
When it was President Calles' turn to rule Mexico, he attempted to curb the power of the church.
Oh, I
He
know what
rehashed
he's gonna talk
communistic
about.
propaganda and added a dash of anti-Europeanism to rally the people against the church.
Yeah, this is not good.
It didn't work. Calles would enforce many anti-Catholic laws, which included restricting the freedom to worship and the persecution of European-born clergy. Perhaps the most draconian measure was using schools to indoctrinate children.
It's
The
pretty
president
interesting, right?
declared,
It's a good
"We
video.
must
I love it.
enter and take possession of the mind of childhood, the mind of
Whoa.
the youth." Mexicans
the
across
fuck?
all economic classes and in nearly every state took to the streets. When that didn't work, they took up arms.
And I think that's the guy who created the agency that handles education in Mexico. So I think that's a very weird comment. I don't know what was that about.
These fighters became known as the Cristeros. Mexico was entering another dark chapter in its history. A very dark chapter.
We are in like the 1930s. No, 1920s, 1930s, about there.
The Cristero Rebellion. Now, this video is about to cover some disturbing events. So much so that some of you may want to jump forward a couple of minutes. Feel free to jump forward to this time to
What?
continue the story. Mexicans
Okay, well, what are you gonna talk about, dude? Okay, you know what?
tolerate poverty,
it.
but they would not tolerate having their religious freedoms taken away. Calles would be brutally aggressive against defiant Catholics. And I do mean brutal. Many innocent worshippers and priests would join the dearly departed.
Yeah, I
This
know.
suppression only encouraged more civilians to join the Cristeros.
Yeah, I think this is gonna be a lot, guys. I think he's gonna cover some sensitive topics, so I'm gonna leave it playing.
But
But
not all of the Cristero fighters
if you don't wanna
were perfectly
watch-
honorable in their quest for religious freedom. The most
I know where
radical
this is going, yeah.
Cristeros would deliberately target public school teachers. Hundreds of teachers would become victims in this conflict.
oh wait, what's wrong with this photo, dude? Am I looking correctly, or am I just too high? What's wrong with their eyes, dude? It looks so weird, and they're all looking at me and shit. That's odd as hell. Well, anyways, I'm sorry for just pausing it. This photo looks awful, dude. The more you look at it, at the faces and shit, what is going on?
Public school teachers. Hundreds of teachers
Yeah,
would
he went
become
full
victims in
stalling,
this
yeah.
conflict. The
Similar.
targeted teachers became known as maestros desorejados, teachers without ears. In some cases, this was a very literal description. If a targeted teacher experienced a quick and painless departure, they would be amongst the fortunate. The most extreme Cristeros had a preference for the same
You know it's bad when in a war they are going after the teachers, you know? I think that's always a terrible sign. I mean, like, really? You're going after teachers? It's just like a really bad sign, you know? Going Pol Pot mode. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, something creepy about it.
techniques
It
that
was-
were
it was
used during the
creepy.
Spanish Inquisition. Bishops would condemn the targeting of teachers and civilians, but controlling the extremist wing of the Cristeros wasn't an easy task. Mexico's culture war had gone
It
hot,
wasn't that
really
extreme,
hot,
you know? It
and
really
everyone
wasn't that
suffered.
extreme.
Despite seeing Mexico crumble before him, President Calles would not back down from his anti-Catholic crusade. His hand-picked successor would be taken out by a Cristero fighter, which created a succession crisis of its own. The message was clear. There would be no peace in Mexico without religious freedom. The official end date of the Cristero rebellion is a matter of debate, but most agree that 250,000 people would not survive the conflict. President Cardenas is largely credited for sowing the seeds of peace. His administration restored the right to worship, and went as far as arresting Calles. Catholic bishops did their part too. They created a legion that infiltrated Cristero rebel groups, and any rebel who advocated
It's just good that Mexico isn't known for this stuff. Yeah, thank God, dude. Thank God nobody hears about this, because it is a pretty dark part in our history. And he just went like 2 minutes and talked about this. I can't blame her for being anti-Catholic. I can't either. I mean, I'm not a Catholic, right? So I can't say I disagree with his methods. Obviously, I do believe in religious freedom. So at the end of the day, his methods were wrong. Although, well, the Catholic Church isn't necessarily always being a force of good, you know? Felt a little bit of dread when I focused on their eyes in the photo. Exactly, dude. That was exactly what I was talking about. The eyes, bro. Look at the eyes in some of these photos. There's something eerie
the
about it.
targeting of civilians would be expelled.
Just too much, man.
Despite the progress towards
Old
peace,
school Mexico is just too
the
much.
conflict would have a permanent impact on Mexico's power structure. The church would forever remain an independent pillar
Yeah.
of power, and the relationship between church and state would remain rocky for many decades. Mexico would not have diplomatic relations with the Vatican until 1992.
Yeah,
Despite the tensions between
That's-
church
that's
and
crazy.
state, the saints of economics were about to bless Mexico. The nation was entering a miracle.
the Mexican miracle. So we are entering World War II around this time. So for you guys to have an idea, I think he's gonna talk about it, but even then, that's pretty awesome. Uh, Here comes the Mexicans' conspiracy theories for random photos.
While far from being a liberal democracy, the PRI proved its value during its first international crisis, the Great Depression.
Oh, the
While
Great
most of
Depression.
the world was grappling with the economic crisis, the Mexican economy proved to be more resilient. Collusion of power can have its perks. During the Depression, the PRI would send shockwaves throughout the international community. The party decided to nationalize the entire oil industry throughout Mexico. Prior to nationalization, most oil extraction was conducted by the American company Standard Oil and the British company El Aguila. The PRI would seize all of the oil producing assets, although the companies would receive compensation for the seizure. With the newly acquired assets and nationalized oil rights, the PRI created a new state-owned oil monopoly called Petróleos Mexicanos.
Oh, you
better
know
known
this
as-
from Hearts of Iron? Dude, really? Oh, I gotta learn how to play, dude. I have the game, but I actually don't know how to play him. I'm not Christian, but what do you mean by that? I don't remember what I said, dude. To be honest.
Pemex. Nationalizing an entire industry is a risky endeavor.
Yeah, really.
Especially when it antagonizes the British and the Americans. In many cases, it can do more harm than good. It scares off private investment, can trigger aggressive tariffs, and tends to result in a shortage of competent business management. However, the PRI had impeccable timing. The oil industry was nationalized in 1938, on the eve of World War II. As
yeah.
the war unfolded, neither the US nor the UK could afford to sanction Mexican oil.
Of course.
The demand for oil would skyrocket during the war, and the nationalization of the liquid hydrocarbons would prove to be very profitable for Mexico. The PRI also introduced tariffs.
So, in a way, in a weird way, you can think about Mexico from like the 1940s, right, up until the 1970s, sort of as a petro state, you know, not that different from a place like Iran or a place like even Saudi Arabia. Mexico was producing a lot of oil, and a lot of the government was being funded by oil. So as the video continues, sort of think about Mexico in that light. You know, Mexico at this moment becomes a petro state.
To bolster the local economy. In normal geopolitical environments, new tariffs tend to lead to
Mr.
trade
Goofy
wars.
Mustache, Austrian
But the
painter.
Anglosphere had far higher priorities than retaliating against Mexico.
They did. They
keep the
had the
Mexican oil
Americans and the
flowing,
British by the balls.
The US and the UK had no choice. If they wanted Mexican oil, then they would have to tolerate Mexican
They would have to
tariffs.
pay, baby.
This made Mexico a quasi-ally to the United States and the United Kingdom, and they would try to remain militarily neutral in the
Yo,
conflict.
we were just talking about neutrality. So Mexico would try to remain neutral, but as a major producer of oil and a major seller of oil to the Allies, the Germans attacked Mexico.
But Mexico's neutrality would not last. In the spring of 1942, German U-boats sank 2 Mexican oil tankers in the Gulf of Mexico. Mexico demanded an apology from the Germans, a demand that
Wow, look at this.
was unfulfilled. After receiving
This
no
is sort of Mexican
response,
World War II propaganda. This is actually like very rare to see, you know? So this translates to remember 13th of May, 1942. So remember when the the Axis sank our ships.
a demand that went unfulfilled.
And this is sort of an eagle with the colors of Mexico destroying a Nazi flag, but I guess he censored it. So this is
After
pretty
receiving
cool.
no response from Germany, Mexico would formally declare war on the Axis powers. This declaration would lead to the formation of the 201st Mexican Fighter Squadron, better known as the Aztec Eagles. The Eagles were based in Manila Bay in the Philippines, and were involved in nearly 800 combat sorties. After the war, the Aztec Eagles were welcomed as heroes. In the post-war economy,
World War II
Mexico
vets.
would adopt a very different economic strategy than most of the world. The prevailing economic theory predicted that international trade would ensure international peace.
Wait, they sunk their ships? Why Mexico? I think uh, Germany was just angry that we were selling oil to the Americans, so they just attacked their ships. I guess it is what it is. Germany had no chill, yeah, none whatsoever. Mexico also took in some Spanish Republicans, right? Yeah, about 50,000, which is a significant number, I guess.
By trading for foreign goods,
Makes sense.
there would be
yeah.
no need to colonize or wage war for desired materials. Why go to war when every nation can get rich through trade? This economic theory would be the main inspiration for the European Union and modern globalization. Despite the new global trend, Mexico, along with most of Latin America, opted to stick with a more mercantilist strategy. In the post-war world, Mexico kept their economy isolated, with high tariffs, import quotas, and licenses that restricted imported goods. The Mexican economy would remain Mexican, regardless of what foreign economists thought. As Mexico was quite protectionist, exports would be a small sliver of the economy. Most of these exports were raw materials, such as precious metals and oil. As tariffs tend to be retaliatory, Mexican goods would be artificially expensive on the global market. Additionally, protected economies tend to produce inferior goods. Without pressure from foreign competition,
What he's saying is really important because these were the basis for the Mexican economy, a very closed economy, an economy that mainly relied on internal growth. So it was very slow. At the time when everyone and their mother were talking about international trade, right? So Mexico never hopped into that ship of international trade, still remaining a very closed economy. It sort of worked a little bit for them, and you'll see that in this era, the Mexican miracle, it was sort of working. But at the end of the day, it was doomed to fail, and it failed miserably. We were in a really rough spot, which I think he'll mention or he'll talk about. Like, damn, yeah. How long is this video? I think it's long. It's 36 minutes. But
Mexican goods
it's long.
didn't have to meet global standards to achieve domestic success. The PRI would have a very hands-on approach with domestic industries, making Mexico a mixed, corporatist economy. Big government and big business were deeply intertwined. Mexican companies could easily accept both private and government investment. Of course, government investment came with strings attached. Some of these conditions were for the benefit of the people. Other conditions reeked of corruption. Mexico would even go as far as to restrict the export of their oil. Better to keep energy prices low for domestic consumption. The isolated and mixed economy actually worked very well for Mexico. The nation would enjoy decades of impressive growth. Economists around the world were starting to dub Mexico's growth as the Mexican miracle. Little did the world know that Mexico was on the path to disaster, all due to a geopolitical crisis far, far away from North America. The world as we know it forever changed on the 6th of October, 1973. The epicenter of this dynamic change occurred over 10,000 kilometers away from Mexico. In the
Israel?
re-established nation of Israel, citizens were celebrating the Yom Kippur holiday, and they were suddenly attacked by Egypt and Syria. This military conflict didn't even last for 3 weeks, but its consequences are still with us today. While Israel won the conflict, the Arab and Persian world weren't too happy with the outcome, frustrated with the quick loss. These nations
This stuff,
decided
yeah,
to deploy
exactly.
a full-on oil
Yeah.
embargo.
It's this stuff. I was thinking the exact same thought. I was like, oh my God, is this stuff really? But yeah, basically the oil protest of the Gulf states, right? Where everyone got scared about the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates and whatnot because they were restricting their oil, right? Iran to all of them. So we'll see the
On
consequences.
Israel's closest allies. The main targets of the embargo included the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Japan, and the Netherlands. To prevent middlemen from bypassing the embargo, the OPEC nations also reduced oil production. Regardless of a nation's stance on the Israeli-Arab conflict, the entire world would feel the pain of OPEC's wrath.
The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided
very
to use
salty,
their oil
yeah.
as a political weapon. They will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territories.
In the end, the OPEC nations would cut oil production by 25%. When news of OPEC's moves became public, the price of oil skyrocketed. Mexico had little to worry about during this upheaval. One of the perks of having an isolated economy is protection from geopolitical chaos. This was especially true for Mexico, given that they had plenty of domestic oil. As Pemex wasn't exporting oil at this time, Mexico was shielded from skyrocketing oil prices. But with global oil prices so high, it sure would be nice if Mexico could cash in on the situation. In a short manner of time, Mexico couldn't resist the temptation and got back in the oil export game. And since prices were so incredibly high, why not go all in on oil? To truly bolster oil exports, Mexico took on quite a bit of foreign debt to expand oil production. The oil embargo wouldn't even last a full year, but it didn't matter. The era of cheap oil would never return. OPEC made it clear that they are a legitimate cartel not to be messed with. They had no problem manipulating the price of oil for economic gains and geopolitical pressure. This was all very good news for Mexico, and the timing couldn't have been better. Mexico had just discovered an ocean of new oil reserves, particularly the Cantarell oil fields. Mexico's known oil reserves increased by 151%.
Yeah, again, so we go back to this thing about Mexico being like this huge oil producer and discovering massive oceans of oil. What he's talking about is basically because they were discovering so much oil, they went all in on it. So they basically took a lot of debt to make investments or more machines, try to discover more oil, right? They were investing into all of this infrastructure, and the earnings, they weren't using the earnings to pay the debts. They were using the earnings, well, first of all, corruption, right? They were taking some of that money for themselves, but then they were spending it on dumb shit, you know?
1977 and 1978, and the government took on more debt to fund more extraction. Yeah. Pemex was making
oil
a
is the
ton
cause
of money
of a
in the
lot
70s.
Of things. Yeah,
some of the cash windfall
it can
was
sometimes
used
be a curse.
wisely, such as a significant expansion of elementary education and increasing access to medical services.
Some of the money was well spent.
Other investments were not so wise. If a private company was struggling to remain financially solvent, the Mexican government would give them an injection of cash. The PRI did a lot of this. In 1975, government investment accounted for 42% of all capital investment. But why invest in a failing business when the government could just outright buy it? That's what the PRI did, to an alarmingly high degree. Before the oil bonanza, Mexico had 391 state-owned enterprises. That number would triple in a decade. These state-owned enterprises did not need to be profitable.
Bro, it was so
they could
bad.
Pay all of their bills with oil money. Subsidies to state-owned enterprises.
So all of the money they were making was used for a lot of these dumb investments or just buying businesses, or it was not a very good use of that money, you know? And sort of, you know, in personal finances, you sort of learn to, in times of prosperity, save. So when you are facing financial hardships, like all of us will at some point, you have some savings, right, to fall back on. So at this point, instead of being like Norway, you know, using some of that money with some brains, right, they spent it on dumb shit. So when prices of oil fell, and I guess I am spoiling a little bit, but oil prices eventually fell, and the Mexicans went from making a lot of money to basically no money, and now they had a bunch of debt to pay, and they just couldn't.
Prices accounted for nearly 13% of Mexico's total GDP. The Mexican economy was artificially supported with oil.
Oh, I just want to say earlier you said CPP. Yeah, I think you're right. Instead of Chinese Communist Party, CCP, Party of Pakistan that no longer exists. Oh,
Oil profits. While this corporatist approach did protect failing companies and limit unemployment, it would not be sustainable. The policy of keeping dying businesses alive with oil profits was a very risky
yeah, it
endeavor.
was terrible.
If oil prices fell, Mexico would be in big trouble. Compounding the risk was Mexico's rising debts. The smart move
Mexico didn't learn how to manage prosperity, and I think that was a huge problem. They just didn't knew how to manage so much money, so they lost it all.
would have used oil profits to pay off the debts that were used to build up the oil industry in the first place. But the PRI behaved in a way that assumed oil prices would never go down.
Yeah.
Oil prices stayed mostly constant after the embargo ended, but they would surge again due to another conflict in the Middle East. The people of Iran decided that they very much don't like their Shah,
the
and
Shah,
decided
yeah.
to chase him out of the country. As Iran is a major oil producer, prices skyrocketed again. This was very good news for Mexico. But the second oil crisis would be short-lived. The oil shortage of the 70s would lead to the oil glut of the 80s. During the 1970s, Mexico wasn't the only country that had a strong reaction to the rise of oil prices. Other oil-rich, conflict-neutral nations also ramped up their oil production to cash in.
Yeah, like Brazil or like Angola, you know, like these places that were not in the Middle East and weren't really affected by all of the conflicts between Israel and some of the Arab countries. So all of those countries, including Mexico, started to produce a lot of oil. But because the United States and Canada and the UK were like embargoed, they started to really be careful about how they use their oil. They started being more efficient, right? The United States started like doing efficiency on cars and other equipment and other machines, tractors, right? And like all of these countries had big reforms, so they started using less oil. So in the 80s, what happened is you got a bunch of oil, but the demand for oil is going down. People are not using that much oil anymore. So prices went down hard. Not sure if this is a weird question, but did the cartel problem decrease at all after the guy nicknamed the Cartel Killer was being manufactured? I learned about that stuff, about the new gun that the army is using. I honestly have no idea. I honestly really don't know. Why would a gun be a game changer for war?
The 5 embargoed nations also upped their oil and energy production. The United States started drilling in Alaska, the UK in the North Sea, and the Netherlands ramped up natural gas production in the Groningen gas fields. Canada pioneered new technologies to extract oil from the tar sands of Alberta. Japan had no fossil fuel reserves.
Yeah, Japan was
so they
really
made big
screwed.
investments in nuclear energy. Increased energy production wasn't the only reaction of the embargoed nations. They also made big strides to reduce consumption. The United States started mandating fuel efficiency standards for cars via the CAFE standard regulation, which remains in place to this day. The Netherlands made it illegal to drive on Sundays, which would be a major inspiration for present-day Dutch city
Oh, they used horses?
drive on Sundays, which
They used horses in Amsterdam. Look at all the crap in the ground. I don't think this is a nice way to travel around the city, you know? Just traveling around a bunch of horses, you know? I can't think of anything worse than that, actually.
would be a major inspiration for present-day Dutch city design. Canada adopted a more greedy strategy. They decided to dramatically restrict their oil exports, which only worsened the crisis for their friends. The UK, which was already dealing with high inflation prior to the oil crisis, had to make more dramatic moves. Blackouts were very common in the kingdom, which forced retailers to use portable gas lamps to stay open. Industries that were heavily reliant on oil were restricted to 3-day work weeks. freeing up oil for the rest of the country. Japan was significantly more dependent on oil imports than any of the other embargoed nations. They had to make the most dramatic changes of the group. Pretty much every industry endured some type of restriction. This included limitations of Tokyo's famous neon lights and forcing bars and restaurants to close before sundown. Japan would also change their position in the Israeli-Arab conflict and realign to become more friendly to the OPEC nations. While energy travels at the speed of light, the effects of energy policy are painfully slow.
Yep.
No matter the energy source, new extraction and development can take years, sometimes even over a decade. In the 1970s, the entire non-OPEC world was ramping up their energy production, but the yields of these investments would not be seen for several years. In the meantime, aggressive conservation policies were being implemented to curb energy demand. When the 1980s arrived, these new energy sources were coming online in mass, and oil prices began to tumble. Oil glut had arrived, and this was very bad news for Mexico. All those investments in failing businesses by the Mexican government would come back to haunt them in dramatic fashion. With falling oil prices, Mexico struggled to keep up with their foreign debt obligations.
Exactly.
To make matters worse, the United States was fighting inflation and raised their interest rates. This made it more difficult to acquire new debt. Given that Mexico had become overly reliant on oil exports, creditors became uneasy about granting new loans to Mexico. The
Yeah,
Mexican
exactly. So imagine that. Now you don't have any more cash flow, right? Because the oil prices are so down. You don't have as much money. So you need to acquire more debt. But now the United States raises interest, so you're going to pay more. That debt is going to be more expensive. And the more debt you acquire and the least you pay, it's getting you a bad credit score, right? So the more debt you acquire, it becomes more and more expensive because they're giving you higher and higher interests. So it's just like a big circle. You acquire debt to pay back other debt, but that debt that you acquire is now more expensive because it has higher interests. And this is what happens to a lot of countries, even a place like Argentina, right? It's just really, really tough to get out because you need money coming in. You need debt.
economy was in a perfect storm. The decline of oil prices, poor management of a mixed economy, excessive debt, and rising interest rates all led to the 1982 economic crisis of Mexico. Banco de Mexico was running out of reserves, and the nation was on the brink of default.
Oh, really? My parents remember the blackouts during this time in the United Kingdom. That's interesting, man.
Mexico had little choice but to embrace privatization and neoliberalism, albeit with a Mexican twist. Many of the unprofitable enterprises would be put on the auction block. Private buyers would take over the enterprises and would have to find a way to make them profitable or join the graveyard of failed businesses that couldn't survive Darwinistic capitalism. The revenue the government gained through privatization would be used to service debts. Mexico wouldn't privatize all state-owned enterprises. They would hold on to the ones that were able to generate cash flows, specifically Pemex, telecoms, and the National Lottery. The best part about a state-owned lottery is that the government can have quite a bit of influence on who the winner is. With the combination of
Lost
privatization and the reduction of corporate welfare, it seemed that Mexico might get out of their economic mess with only a few scars. But then 1986 arrived, and things got even worse for Mexico. Oil prices would completely crash. Not dip, not slide, but full-on crash. Poor Mexico. So far from God, so close to
Most of this is pretty new to me, so I'm enjoying learning about this. Yeah, I know. A lot of it is actually like kind of new to me. A lot of this I'm learning. It's super interesting.
oil. Mexico was now at the point where they were struggling to make interest payments on their debt. In order to keep providing the most basic government services, Mexico had to fire up the money printing machines. Mexico was embarking on a long and painful recession that was coupled with double-digit inflation. The Mexican economy was in a complete freefall. The 80s would be a painful time for most Mexicans and would be known as the lost decade. But the hard times would lead to radical transformations. Transformations that would not only save Mexico, but forever change the North American continent. Changes that still impact our lives today.
Yo veo un México con hambre y con sed de justicia. Un México de gente agraviada por las distorsiones que imponen a la ley,
So this guy,
quienes deberían de servirla, de mujeres y hombres afligidos por abuso de las autoridades o por la arrogancia de las oficinas gubernamentales.
nice speech.
No.
So this guy, oh my God, the video is gonna end now. Oh, it can't end like that. Well, so this guy was a political candidate who was very promising, but he got killed, and he had a lot of new ideas, right? And he was very neoliberal and pro the West, and he was very against corruption and stuff, even though he was from the PRI, right? So there's like a huge thing around this guy. He got killed, so we don't know to this day who really killed him. And yeah, he's just, I guess, a symbol of promise in Mexico. He's a symbol of a young politician who wanted change, sort of like John F. Kennedy. I think he's like the John F. Kennedy of Mexico. I mean, they have the same colors in the flags. Yeah, I like how the pre-flag looks like the Italian flag exactly.
Queremos priistas en la comodidad de la inercia, sino en el esfuerzo del cambio.
Oh, dude, watch part 2 on Patreon? What? Don't do this to me, my man. Pike Productions. Part 2 is on Patreon. Oh, come on, brother. That sucks. But that was an amazing speech. I know, right? He was such a good, he used to give great speech. He was just overall a great politician. He gave great speeches. I don't know. He was very good. I never got to experience him. I was not born at that time. It was like the late 90s. I was born in 1999. So I wasn't alive to see all of this. But of course, you hear a lot about, your parents tell you what happened, your grandparents, and a lot of people sort of lived this. And it was a crazy moment in Mexican history. It really was. I was hoping if the part 2 of this, but it's not. There's no part 2. So that's a little sad, but I'm sure he's gonna post it maybe someday. I don't know. Well, let's watch some Hoser,